Victor Langley stepped onto the platform at Caldwell Station like he owned every plank of it, because soon enough, he would. He moved past the huddled figures waiting in the cold without a glance, his wool coat pressed, his boots polished despite the mud. In his breast pocket sat a folded document that had taken him 4 months to assemble quietly, one debt at a time, one signature at a time. Harper Ranch, 1,200 acres of the best grazing land in the territory, and its owner too proud and too stubborn to see the hole he'd been sinking into for 3 years running. Langley paused near the freight office, pulled out the document, and smiled at it the way a man smiles at something already finished. He didn't notice the woman sitting on the far end of the bench. Nobody ever did. If this story already has your attention, you're in exactly the right place. Hit that like button right now, drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. Because I promise you, this is the kind of story that stays with you. Now let's go back to where it really began. The bench at Caldwell Station was made of pine, and it had been painted green once, maybe 15 years ago. Now it was just gray and splintered, and in the middle of November it held cold the way cast iron holds cold, deep and personal and unforgiving. Margaret Ashford had been sitting on it for 2 days. Not the whole bench, mind you. She sat at the far end, the end closest to the freight loading platform where grain sacks were shifted twice a day and where the men handling them were sometimes careless. Yesterday she had found nearly a full cup of dried corn that had split from a torn sack. She had eaten it slowly, a few kernels at a time, making it last. She was 58 years old. She had a carpet bag that held 2 changes of clothes, a hairbrush missing 4 teeth, a folded letter from the bank that she no longer needed to read because she had every word memorized, and a plain gold band on a piece of string around her neck. Thomas's ring, because her fingers had thinned enough in the last months that it didn't stay on anymore. She did not think of herself as destitute. She thought of herself as between situations. That was the phrase she used in her own mind, in the quiet private voice she kept just for herself. Between situations. Not broken. Not finished. Between. It was the same voice that had kept her moving through the 8 months since Thomas died, through the sale of the house to pay his medical debts, through the rented room she'd taken in Harlow, through the job at the laundry that lasted 6 weeks before her hands gave out, through the morning 3 days ago when the landlady had stood at the door with her arms folded and said, without any particular meanness, "I can't carry the room past Friday, Mrs. Ashford. You understand." She'd understood. She'd packed the carpet bag and walked to the station because it was heated during the day, and because there was nowhere else she knew to go, and because a woman who has kept her dignity through everything else does not simply sit down in the road. The morning of the 3rd day was worse than the 2 before it. A night wind had come down from the mountains and found every gap in the station's old board walls, and Margaret had slept in pieces. An hour here, 40 minutes there, with her coat pulled up over her ears and her feet tucked under her on the bench. Around 4 in the morning, a freight agent had come through with a lantern and told her she'd have to move on come full light. She'd nodded because there was no point arguing with a man holding a lantern and a schedule, and she'd sat upright in the dark and waited. She watched the station come to life the way she'd watched it the 2 mornings before. The ticket window opening. The first travelers arriving with their valises and their purposes, their destinations already decided. Children who pulled at their mother's hands. Men who checked their pocket watches and squinted at the board. Nobody looked at her. Or rather, people looked just long enough to see what she was and then looked deliberately away, which was a different thing entirely, and which she understood without bitterness. She'd done the same herself, once. In another life, in another coat, she had passed people on benches without meeting their eyes. She understood it now better than she ever had then. She was watching a sparrow work the base of the far freight cart. Same as she did, she thought with a small private humor. Same enterprise, same patch of territory. When she heard boots on the platform, not the shuffle of waiting passengers. These were deliberate boots, the kind that know where they're going. She didn't look up right away. Looking up too quickly at strangers had cost she'd learned to avoid. The boots stopped. She could see them at the edge of her vision, brown, worn at the heel, clean but not polished. Working boots that had been dressed up as much as they were ever going to be. And then a pair of trousers, canvas and worn at the knee, and then a coat that was heavy wool and missing a button at the chest. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice was careful. Not the careful of a man who thought she was dangerous, but the careful of a man who wasn't sure of the right thing to say and was trying not to start wrong. She looked up. He was taller than she'd guessed from just his boots, maybe 6 feet, or close enough. 40 or so, she'd have said, except for something around his eyes that put years on him that his body hadn't gotten yet. Dark hair going gray at the temple, a jaw that hadn't been shaved since yesterday, and a hat he was holding in both hands at his chest like a man standing outside a church. He was looking at her the way people almost never did, not past her, not away from her, at her. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said. "I'm looking for someone, and I may have the wrong person." "Then I'll save us both the time," Margaret said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her faintly. "I'm not anyone you'd have sent for." He blinked. Then something shifted in his face, not quite a smile. More like a man catching himself making an assumption and backing up. "No, I don't suppose you are. I had a woman coming on the morning train from Hatchet, a cook. He stopped, turned, looked at the empty platform where the morning train had unloaded 30 minutes ago, and then pulled out again, headed west. "She didn't come." "People change their minds," Margaret said. "About arrangements they've already been paid for?" "About everything." He stood there a moment. She expected him to put his hat back on and walk away. Instead, he looked at her. Not at her coat or her carpet bag or the bench, but at her face, the way a man tries to read weather off a sky he doesn't know yet. "Ma'am," he said, and then he stopped again. Started over. "I've got 11 men at my ranch who have been eating what my trail boss cooks, and my trail boss burns water. I've got a winter coming that'll shut the mountain roads by month's end, and I came to town today to bring back the one person who could feed those men between now and spring." He turned the hat brim through his hands. Once, twice. "I know I'm asking out of nowhere," he said, "and I know I don't look like much standing here, but I'll pay fair wages, there's a room with a door that locks, and I'll drive you back to town myself the minute you want to leave." He paused. "Can you cook?" The question landed simply. No performance in it, no charity dressed up as something else. He was just a man who needed something and had looked around and found her and decided to ask. She was quiet long enough that a lesser man would have filled the silence with more words. He didn't. He just waited, hat in both hands, and let her think. "I've spent 40 years feeding families who had nothing but hope left," she said. He nodded once, slowly, like she'd told him something he could use. "That'll do," he said. "My name's Cole Harper." "Margaret Ashford." "Mrs. Ashford." He looked at the carpet bag. "Is that everything?" "That's everything." He reached down and picked it up before she could move, held it easy, like it weighed nothing. "Wagon's out front," he said. "I'll get your ticket refunded from the—" He looked at her, stopped, recalculated without a word, without making anything of it. "I'll get the wagon." She stood, and her knees ached from 2 nights of that bench, and she didn't let it show because she'd had 2 days of practice not showing things, and she followed Cole Harper off the platform and into whatever came next. The wagon was a ranch wagon, a working one, hay residue in the bed, a rope coiled under the seat, the wood worn smooth at the edges from years of use. Not a comfortable ride, but an honest one. The horse was a solid roan gelding who didn't startle when Margaret stepped up, which she took as a minor good sign. Cole took the reins. He didn't talk as they cleared the town, and she didn't either, and she found that she didn't mind. There was a certain comfort in silence that didn't ask anything from you. Thomas had had that. A lot of men talked to fill space. Thomas had known what space was for. She missed him in a way that had gotten quieter over the months, but not smaller. You don't get over 40 years, you just get used to carrying them. After about a mile, Cole spoke. "You said 40 years feeding families. Where was that?" "East of here, Harlow, mostly, and before that Simmons Point. Before that, wherever my husband's work took us." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "He managed freight for the station circuit out of Harlow. We moved a lot in the early years." Freight management, he said, and she heard him file it away the way a careful man files things. The routing, the ledgers, the contracts with suppliers. I helped when he needed it. She paused, which was most of the time. Cole didn't say anything to that. She appreciated him for it. A lot of men would have said something like that must have been useful, or what a capable woman, and she'd have had to smile at it and let it go, and that kind of letting go had a cost too. They rode on. The road climbed slowly through scrub and frost-brown grass, and the mountains ahead had their first real snow on the upper faces, white against a pewter sky. Margaret watched them and thought about what she was doing, which she hadn't let herself do on the platform because you can't afford to think too hard about your options when you only have one. She didn't know this man. She had his name and his hat and the fact that he'd picked up her bag without making anything of it. She had the fact that he'd looked at her like a person. That was more than she'd gotten from most people in 8 months. She'd take it. "How many in your house?" she asked. 11 ranch hands, foreman named Dud Greer. He's been with the ranch since my father's time. No family in the house. He glanced at her, brief. My wife died 4 years ago. I'm sorry. Yeah. That was all he said, and she knew what that yeah meant. It was the same sound that answered all the condolences you eventually just wanted to stop receiving. Children? No. A pause. We tried. Another pause that closed the subject without slamming it. She nodded and looked at the road. The woman who didn't come, she said, after a few minutes. What happened? Her telegram came day before yesterday. Said she'd taken work in the city. More money. He shrugged. Can't blame her. You're not angry about it? He thought about it. Actually thought, rather than answering right away. I was for about an hour. Then I figured she had her reasons, and they were probably sound ones. He looked at the road. I don't generally stay angry at people for looking after themselves. She marked that too. The Harper Ranch revealed itself in pieces. First the fence line, then the barn roof, then the main house and the outbuildings arranging themselves around a muddy yard as the wagon came down the last slope. It was a working ranch. That was the first thing you could say about it. Everything had that look of being used and used hard. Not neglect exactly. More like a place where the work had gotten ahead of the maintenance, which is a different thing. Fences that needed reposting. A gate hanging at an angle. The barn door had been rehung, but the new hinge was already off, true. The second thing you noticed was that everything that could be functional was functional. The water trough was full and clean. The woodpile was substantial. The horses in the paddock looked well fed and cared for. A man with too much to do, but who knew what mattered. She'd worked with worse. 3 ranch hands stopped what they were doing when the wagon pulled in. They were trying not to stare, which meant they stared badly. One of them, older, heavy-set, with a gray mustache and the walk of a man whose knees have opinions, came over as Cole set the brake. Well, this man said, looking at Margaret with an expression she'd learned to read in the first second. Not unkind, but skeptical in the particular way of men who'd had enough disappointments to protect themselves against hope. Mrs. Ashford, Cole said, this is Dud Greer. He runs the ranch hands and will make sure nobody bothers you. Ma'am, Dud said, touching his hat brim. Then to Cole, quietly, she's not what I pictured. She never asked to be, Cole said, and climbed down from the wagon. Margaret climbed down herself, not waiting for a hand, and looked at Dud Greer straight on. He was measuring her. She let him measure. What did you picture? She asked. He blinked. Not many people asked Dud Greer direct questions, she guessed. Someone younger, he said, which was honest at least. Younger doesn't mean better, she said. Show me the kitchen. He looked at Cole. Cole had his carpet bag and was walking toward the house. This way, Dud said, and she followed. The kitchen was worse than she'd expected, which was something given how low she'd set the bar on the drive over. It wasn't dirty in the way of carelessness. Someone had made efforts, that was visible. It was disordered in the way of a space run by people who didn't know what they were doing. Pots in the wrong places, dry goods half organized, a flour barrel standing open in the corner. A smell she placed after a second. Something had been stored poorly and was beginning to turn. Smoked meat, probably, with the smoke not heavy enough. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and turned slowly, looking at everything once. Then she said, "I'll need those 2 shelves emptied and rearranged before tonight. And something is going bad in your larder. I need to see what's in there before any more of it is used." Dud stared at her. "You've been here 4 minutes. The smell has been there longer than 4 minutes," she said. "Where are your eating arrangements for tonight? What time do your men come in?" 6 o'clock, supper." She looked at the window. 4 hours of light left. "All right," she said. "I'll need water, firewood, and whoever is smallest and willing to help me reach those upper shelves." The man Dud sent to help her was called Petey, 18 at most, gap-toothed, with a wiry quickness about him that she immediately trusted more than the muscle of bigger men. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking like he'd been told he was being punished. "Ma'am?" "Petey, good. Come in and don't bump anything until we know what we're looking at." She gestured at the larder. "Open that door and tell me everything you see." He opened it. He looked. He made a face. "Smells bad." "Yes, it does. What's in there?" He read off a list: smoked beef, salt pork, various dry goods, a crock of something, preserves in jars. And she listened and sorted as he spoke. "The beef," she said. "Bring it out." He brought it out. She looked at it closely, pressed it, smelled it carefully. "This isn't gone entirely," she said. "How long has it been in there?" "Since September, I think." "Who hung it?" "Charlie did, but Charlie left in October." She looked at the cut again. "It's at the edge. We can save most of it if we act now. Do you have vinegar?" "I think." "Find out. And while you're looking, tell me about the crock." This was how the next 3 hours went. It wasn't cooking yet. It was triage. She moved through the kitchen and the larder the way she'd moved through emergencies all her life, which was to say, without theatrics, without sighing about the state of things, without wasting time on blame. Things were as they were. The question was always what you could do about them starting right now. The smoked beef she treated with vinegar and a dry rub of salt and pepper, and she hung it differently, lower and with better air. 2 of the jars of preserves were fine. 1 she set aside and told Petey not to use under any circumstances. The flour barrel got a lid. She found one behind the woodpile where someone had left it. And the dried beans she found in 3 separate corners of the larder got consolidated and inventoried. Then she started supper. She had potatoes, which were fine. She had dried beans soaking now, too late for tonight but ready for tomorrow. She had onions. She had the remaining smoked beef that was still good. She had a partial sack of cornmeal. She had a larder that had been a disaster 30 minutes ago and was now functional. She made a thick stew, heavier than was elegant, with the beef and the potatoes and the onions and everything seasoned properly, which turned out to be the one thing that had been missing from every meal served in this kitchen for what smelled like months. She made cornbread in the cast iron, which she found under 2 other pots in the wrong cabinet, and seasoned with the bacon grease she found hardened in a tin near the stove. At 6 o'clock, Petey carried the pot out to the dining area, which was a long room off the kitchen with a single table and 10 mismatched chairs. She stood at the kitchen door and watched the men come in. They were loud before they sat down. After, they got quiet. She'd seen it happen 100 times in her life, and it still meant something to her. That quiet that falls over people when they're eating something that actually tastes like what it's supposed to be. It's not a dramatic quiet. It's more like a group of people all deciding at the same time to stop performing and just be fed. Dud Greer was the last one to sit. He looked at the bowl in front of him for a moment. Then he looked at the kitchen door. She stepped back before he could see her looking. Cole appeared in the kitchen while she was cleaning the pot. He had a bowl too, which meant he'd eaten in the dining room with his men, not separately, which she noted. "They're asking about tomorrow," he said. "Beans," she said. "Proper ones." "That cornbread, it's fine." He was quiet for a second. "I mean, it tastes like something my wife used to—" He stopped. "Sorry, I'm not trying to—" "Don't apologize for it," she said, without turning from the pot. "If it tastes like something someone you loved used to make, that's the best thing I can hear." Another brief silence. "How's the larder situation?" he said, which was his way of changing the subject and also not entirely changing it. "Salvageable," she said. "But you were losing money every week with the way things were stored. I'll need to write up what you have and what you're missing before I can plan through the winter. She paused. I'll need an accounting of what you spend on supplies each month if you can get me that. Why? She turned and looked at him then. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his empty bowl, and he had that careful expression on again, the one that was trying to read her. Because feeding 11 men through a mountain winter without wasting anything is half planning and half arithmetic, she said. And I've done enough arithmetic in my life to know the first number you need is what things actually cost. He looked at her for a long moment. I'll get you the ledger in the morning, he said. Thank you. He nodded once. Then he looked at his kitchen, at the shelves she'd reorganized, the larder door properly closed, the pots hung where they should be. You did all this in one afternoon, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I had 4 hours and someone willing to hand me things, she said. It's not remarkable. Maybe not, he said. And then, quietly, as if he wasn't sure he meant to say it out loud, I think it might be. He left before she could answer. She stood in the clean kitchen with her hands in the wash water, listening to the sound of the ranch settling into night, the low talk from the dining room thinning out, the sound of boots on the porch boards, someone's laugh cut short by the cold air. Her room was off the kitchen, a small room, a real room, with a door that latched and a window that faced the mountain. There was a cot with 2 blankets and a small chest for her things. She sat on the cot for a moment and held Thomas's ring in her palm without looking at it, just held it. She had not expected to feel anything like relief. She had aimed for something smaller, a roof, a door that latched, something to do with her hands. She had not budgeted for anything like the quiet satisfaction of supper going well, of a kitchen that was functional, of a man who said maybe not, and then said I think it might be, and who had the decency to look at you while he said it. She put the ring back on its string and lay down on the cot with her coat still on. Outside, the wind was still coming off the mountain. Inside, for the first time in a long time, it was only wind. She was asleep in 4 minutes. In the morning, she was up before anyone, and the fire was going and the water was heating, and she was at the larder taking proper inventory by the time the first gray light came under the kitchen door, and she wrote the numbers in a neat column on the paper Cole had left for her. And the paper was cheap paper and the pencil was short, but her handwriting was still what it always had been, clear, even, and difficult to misread. She was, she thought, between situations no longer. She was, for now, exactly where the work was. That was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was, without her planning it or particularly hoping for it, the beginning of something that would take the whole winter to understand. The beans were ready by 6 in the morning, which was earlier than Dud Greer had ever seen a meal waiting in that kitchen. He came in through the back door the way he always did, stomping mud off his boots at the threshold, and stopped when he smelled it. Real cooking smell. Not the scorched grain smell that Charlie had left behind. Not the watery nothing that the 3 men who'd taken turns at the stove in October had produced. This was something with depth to it. Something that had been thought about. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he needed to. Margaret was at the stove with her back to him, stirring the pot with a long-handled spoon and making notes on a piece of paper she'd pinned to a board beside the stove. She didn't turn around. "Beans are at 6, she said. "Cornbread's in the iron. There's coffee if you want it before the others are up." He poured himself a cup and stood at the far end of the kitchen counter, because the chair at the small table had her things on it. The paper, a pencil, the ledger Cole had brought her that morning, already open. "You been up long?" he asked. "Since 4. He looked at the window. It was still dark outside. "Why?" "Because the inventory I started last night wasn't finished, and I wanted the numbers before breakfast." She turned a page of the ledger without pausing her stirring. "Your supplier in Caldwell has been charging you for grade A smoked pork for 3 months, but the quality coming in is grade B at best. You're paying a 15% premium for something you're not receiving." Dud stopped with the coffee halfway to his mouth. "How do you know that?" "Because I know what grade A smoked pork smells like, and what's in your larder, isn't it?" She glanced at him over her shoulder, brief. "Also because the weight on the last delivery was logged as 40 pounds, and the actual remaining weight after reasonable use would put the original closer to 34. Someone's been shorting you at the scale. He set the cup down. Cole know this? Not yet. I want to finish the full count first before I bring him numbers I'm not certain of. She turned back to the stove. The coffee's strong. Don't let it sit too long. Dud Greer drank his coffee and looked at the back of Margaret Ashford's head and thought about what kind of person shows up on your ranch with one bag and starts reading your accounts before dawn. He wasn't sure yet whether it was remarkable or alarming. He'd been wrong before about which was which. The men came in at 6, and the kitchen had already moved past the moment of the beans, because she'd also fried the remaining salt pork, the good portion, trimmed and properly rendered, and set out the cornbread from last night still wrapped in cloth, so it had stayed softer than it had any right to. There was coffee enough for everyone. The beans were seasoned with things she'd found in the back of a shelf that nobody had touched in so long the labels had faded, but the herbs inside were still good, and she'd known which ones. The ranch hands filed in the way men do when they're expecting the usual and have already made their peace with it. Then they sat down. Then the quiet fell again, the same as the night before, and this time Margaret was watching from the kitchen doorway, and she saw it happen to each of them in turn. A kind of involuntary attention, a pause in the chewing to actually taste what was in their mouths. Pete Dunbar, who was 47 and had worked cattle most of his adult life and was not a man given to commentary, said, "What's in these beans?" "Beans," she said. He looked at her. "That's not funny." "I wasn't trying to be. Beans, onion, the pork, pepper, a little dried thyme from your back shelf that someone forgot they had. That's all." He looked back at the bowl. "Huh," he said, and went back to eating. Across the table, a younger man named Roy Bassett, who was 23 and had a habit of pushing food around his plate that had driven Dud to distraction, was not pushing anything around. He was eating with the focus of a person who suddenly remembered they were hungry. Only one man hadn't sat down. He was standing near the door, arms folded, looking at the table the way someone looks at a situation they've decided they don't trust. He was older than Roy and younger than Pete Dunbar. Stocky, with a beard that was more beard than face, and a general attitude of contained dissatisfaction. "This is what she cooked?" he said, to no one in particular. Margaret looked at him. "Would you like to sit?" "I'm fine standing." "You're welcome to stand," she said. "The bowl's still hot, though, so sooner is better than later if you're eating it." The man, she didn't have his name yet, looked at the bowl, looked at her, sat down with the air of someone who was doing everyone a favor and planned for them to know it. She went back to the kitchen. His name, Petey told her afterward while helping her clear, was Frank Hale. He'd been on the ranch 2 years, was one of Cole's better hands with the horses but difficult in groups, had opinions about things that he shared loudly and frequently, and had apparently told Roy Bassett the previous evening that the new cook wouldn't last a week. "Why a week?" she asked. "He said older women always leave when the work gets hard." Margaret stacked the plates without responding to this. "Did you tell him," she said after a moment, "that the work was already hard when I got here?" Petey grinned his gap-toothed grin. "No, ma'am." "Don't bother," she said. "He'll figure it out." Cole found her at the supply list around noon, where she'd moved to the small table in the main room after the kitchen was clean, because the light was better there. He came in from outside with mud on his boots and cold on his coat and stopped when he saw her. "I didn't say you could," he caught himself. "That's my accounts table." "Your kitchen table doesn't have enough light in the afternoon," she said without looking up. "I'll clear everything before supper." He stood there for a second. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down with a noise that said his back was giving him trouble today. "What are you finding?" he said. "A lot." She turned the ledger toward him and put her finger on a line. "This supplier in Caldwell, you've been paying first-grade prices for second-grade product for at least 3 months, and the weights have been short." He looked at the line. His jaw tightened. "Harwick's been handling the Caldwell orders," he said. "Who's Harwick?" "He left in September." Cole looked at the ledger, turned back 2 pages, turned forward again. "Right when the discrepancy started, but..." She let that sit without saying the obvious thing, because he was already thinking it. "How much?" he said. At minimum, over those 3 months, somewhere between $60 and $80 in product you paid for and didn't receive. Possibly more if the pattern started before what I can trace from these records. He was quiet for a moment. His hand was flat on the table beside the ledger, and she could see the tension in it. "That's not nothing," he said. "No, it's not. Can you prove it well enough to take to the merchant?" "If you can get me the delivery logs and the original invoices, yes. The figures won't lie." She took the ledger back. "That's not the only problem in here, but it's the most immediate one." He looked at her. "What else?" "Give me until tomorrow morning," she said. "I want to be sure of the numbers before I tell you what they are." It was the way her husband had always worked, and the way she'd learned to work alongside him. Don't bring problems without the numbers, and don't bring numbers until you're sure. Thomas used to say a wrong number stated with confidence is worse than no number at all, because it makes the person you tell it to wrong too. She'd seen it proven enough times to have stopped needing the reminder. Cole looked at her for a moment with that same reading the weather expression. "All right," he said. She went back to the figures. He stayed at the table long enough to finish the cup of coffee she'd poured for herself and left for him without mentioning it, then got up and went back to work. The afternoon went sideways around 3 o'clock. She heard it before she saw it. A noise from the yard that wasn't the usual working ranch noise, sharper and shorter, and then voices, and then the specific quality of silence that follows something going wrong. She came out of the kitchen to find most of the men gathered near the small barn. She went over. Jimmy Crane was 19 years old and had been at Harper Ranch for 8 months and had, everyone agreed, more energy than sense. He'd been working on the hayloft pulley system, which had been malfunctioning for 2 weeks, and had tried to fix it by standing in a spot that nobody should stand in while operating the mechanism, and the system had decided at that moment to demonstrate exactly why. He was on the ground now, arm at an angle that made 2 of the ranch hands look away. His face had gone the color of old plaster. "Somebody get Doc Perkins," Roy Bassett said. "Doc Perkins is in Caldwell," Pete Dunbar said. "Day-and-a-half round trip." "His shoulder's out," Margaret said. Everyone looked at her. She was already moving through the group toward the boy on the ground. "Mrs. Ashford," Dud started. "Has anyone done this before?" she said, kneeling beside Jimmy. Nobody said yes. "Then stop standing there." She looked at Jimmy's face. He was breathing in that careful way that people breathe when moving means pain. "Jimmy, can you hear me?" "Yes, ma'am." Through his teeth. "The shoulder came out of the socket. I'm going to put it back. It'll hurt more before it stops hurting. Are you listening to me?" His eyes found hers. They were scared, which was appropriate, and young, which was unavoidable. "Is that going to work?" he said. "If you hold still and don't fight me." "Yes." A brief pause in which he decided something. "Okay," he said. Frank Hale spoke from somewhere behind her. "You're a cook," he said. "You can't just—" "Frank!" Cole's voice from the edge of the group. Flat. Not loud. Frank went quiet. Margaret looked at Pete Dunbar. "Kneel behind him and hold his other shoulder. Just hold it. Don't pull." Then to Roy. "Find me something he can bite down on. A piece of leather, a folded rag, anything." Roy was gone and back in less than a minute with a strip of leather from the tack room. She folded it and Jimmy took it between his teeth without being asked twice. What she knew about dislocated shoulders she had learned the hard way, over years, in places where you learn things the hard way because the alternative was waiting for help that wasn't coming. Thomas had dislocated his in a freight accident when they were 30 years old and 100 miles from the nearest physician, and she'd watched the station's oldest hand put it right, and she'd remembered every step of it because that was what she did. She watched and she remembered, and she filed things away for the moment they became necessary. She talked through what she was doing, low and steady, more for herself than for Jimmy, and she felt the angle and the position, and she gave it the movement it needed, and then a little more, and then the soft, terrible sound of it going back into place. Jimmy made a noise into the leather strip that she hoped none of his friends would bring up to him later. Then he breathed. "There," she said. She kept his arms supported while Pete Dunbar helped prop him up. She told Roy to find cloth for a sling, and he moved before she finished the sentence. She examined the shoulder again, gently, feeling for what she could feel. It went back clean, she said. He needs it immobilized for at least 2 weeks. No lifting, no overhead work. After that, he starts moving it carefully. She looked at Jimmy's face, which was returning to a more human color. You're going to be sore for a week. That's normal. Thank you, Jimmy said, which came out rougher than he probably intended. You're welcome. She stood. Her knees made their usual protests. Someone help him inside. She walked back toward the kitchen. Behind her, she heard the murmur of the group breaking up, and then Frank Hale's voice, lower now, saying something she couldn't quite hear, and then Pete Dunbar's voice responding, "Then shut your mouth, Frank." She allowed herself one small moment of satisfaction at that, which she kept entirely off her face, and then she went back to the kitchen and put the water on because Jimmy would want something hot, and it was getting cold outside. Dude came to find her an hour later while she was starting supper. He stood in the kitchen doorway the same way he had this morning, except his arms weren't folded now, and his face had a different expression on it. Not the skeptical, measuring look of a man protecting himself against disappointment, but something more careful, more considered. "Where'd you learn to do that?" he said. "The shoulder." "A long time ago," she said. "Necessary situation." "You've done it more than once?" "Twice. Today was the cleanest of the 3. He was quiet for a moment. "Jimmy's asking about you." "What about me?" "He wants to know if you're going to be here a while." She looked at the pot. She thought about the bench at Caldwell Station and the 2 nights of cold and the grain she'd picked up from the freight platform floor. And she thought about the ledger full of numbers she was going to take apart line by line because she knew how and because someone needed to. "I don't have anywhere I need to be," she said. Dud nodded slowly. He'll be glad to hear that. He turned to go, then stopped. This was becoming a habit with him, she noticed. Starting to leave and then finding one more thing. "That thing you found in the accounts," he said. "About the short waits." "Yes?" How long would it have taken Cole to find that himself? She considered the question honestly. "He might not have," she said. "Not without someone who knew what to look for." Dud nodded again. A different kind of nod this time. "He works hard," he said. "He works real hard. He stopped, thought about it. "He's better at the land than the ledger." "A lot of good men are," she said. Something in Dud's face shifted. A small release, like a man putting down something he'd been carrying at an awkward angle. "I gave him a hard time when he brought you back," he said. "In my head, I mean. I didn't say it to his face." "I know," she said. "I could tell." He made a sound that might have been a laugh in a more comfortable man. Then he went back out to the yard. The following 2 weeks had a shape to them that Margaret recognized from her own past. The shape of a place finding its footing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the small adjustments that accumulate into something that actually works. She reorganized the pantry on the 3rd day, which involved Petey moving things to her specifications and Frank Hale appearing in the doorway once to observe that she was rearranging things that weren't broken, and Margaret saying that things didn't need to be broken to be improved, and Frank leaving without pursuing the point further. She made the ranch hand sit down at meals, which sounds like a small thing but was not small. For months, apparently, men had been taking plates at odd hours, eating standing up or outside or at different times, which made cooking anything properly nearly impossible, and also meant nobody actually sat down together long enough to talk. She announced on the 4th day that supper was at 6, breakfast at 6 in the morning, and if anyone missed it, they'd find something covered on the stove, but it wouldn't be warm. Pete Dunbar had laughed at the announcement. "Something funny?" she'd asked. "No, ma'am, just nobody's told this group what time to be anywhere for a year, and they're all going to be here at 6. He was right. They all were. There was something that happened around a table when food was consistently good, something she'd observed for years but never been able to explain to anyone who hadn't experienced it. People stopped being as irritable. Small arguments didn't build into larger ones. Men who'd been getting on each other's nerves through the particular confined friction of a long season started making room for each other again. She didn't take credit for it. It was just what decent, regular food did. It was one of the oldest things there was. She brought Cole the full accounting on a Friday morning, 9 days in. He was at the desk in his small office off the main room, a desk covered in papers that had clearly been covered in papers for some time, and she set the pages she'd prepared in front of him and sat down in the chair across the desk, which she'd moved to face it squarely because the previous angle had been wrong. The Caldwell supplier situation first, she said. I've calculated it over 6 months, not 3. The pattern starts earlier than it looked. He looked at the top page. His jaw did the thing it did when numbers weren't what he wanted them to be. How much total? $112, at minimum. Closer to $130 if the weight shortages were consistent before the logs I can trace. He sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. That's 3 months of one man's wages, he said. Yes. And I didn't catch it. You're running 1,200 acres, she said. You can't see everything. That's not an excuse. No, she said, without softening it. It's not, but it's a reason. He looked at her. Something in his expression was different today. Something tired underneath the steadiness that she hadn't let herself notice until it was obvious. What else? She went through it page by page. Duplicate orders for equipment that was already in the storage barn and hadn't been inventoried in 2 years. An ongoing contract with a feed merchant in the railway town that was 17% above current market rate because it had been negotiated in better years and nobody had renegotiated it since. A rotation system for the horses that was costing an extra hay expenditure of about $4 a month because of inefficient scheduling. She didn't editorialize. She just gave him the numbers and what she thought could be done about each one. He listened without interrupting, which she respected. A lot of men interrupted when you were telling them things they didn't want to hear. Cole Harper sat across the desk with his hands folded and his eyes on the pages, and he listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. If we fix all of this, he said, how much does the operation look different? On an annual basis? She turned to the last page. $340 to $380, depending on how well the renegotiation goes with the feed merchant. He stared at the number. That's significant, he said. Yes. That's the difference between... He stopped. His jaw moved slightly, like he was running figures in his own head now. That's the difference between a bad year and a manageable one. She didn't say anything because he was working through it, and he didn't need her help with that part. The feed merchant, he said. You said renegotiation. You think he'd deal? He'll deal if you can show him you know what the market rate is, and you have the option to go elsewhere. Right now, he knows you can't go elsewhere during winter. The mountain roads make it impractical. But if you go to him before the roads close and you have the numbers in front of you, you have some leverage. You know the market rate on feed? I know where to find it, she said. I've been looking at the regional trade papers that came with your mail last week. No one had read them. Cole looked at the pile of unopened newspapers and circulars on the corner of his desk. Then he looked at her. You read those? The relevant sections. A silence. Mrs. Ashford, he said. He stopped, started again. You came here to cook. I came here because you asked if I could cook, she said. You didn't ask me to stop knowing other things. It came out with a little more edge than she'd intended, and she watched him decide how to receive it. He looked at her for a moment, and then the corner of his mouth turned, and not the polite kind, the real kind, slightly crooked, like it surprised him. Fair point, he said. She gathered the pages back into order. I'll start on the meal rotation plan for the rest of the winter this afternoon if you can give me the expected head count through March. 11 through January, might drop to 8 in February if I let the seasonal men go early. All right. She stood. One more thing. What? Frank Hale. Cole's expression went careful. What about him? He's going to keep being a problem, she said. Not a dangerous one, but a persistent one. I'm not asking you to do anything about it. I just want you to know I'm aware of it, and I'm not going to let it become my problem. Cole looked at her steadily. How are you going to do that? By being better at my job than he is at his, until he either adjusts or leaves. She paused. That's usually how it works. He nodded slowly. And if it doesn't work? Then you have a different decision to make, she said. But that one's yours. She left him at the desk with the numbers in front of him and the corner of his mouth still turned up in that way he probably didn't know about. And she went back to the kitchen and she started the plan for February's meals on a clean sheet of paper, and outside the window the mountain had another inch of snow on it since yesterday. She was warm. Her hands were busy. The numbers in her head were adding up to something that wasn't nothing. That was enough. And for the second time in 2 weeks, a version of enough that was more than she'd budgeted for. At supper that night, she put a bowl of stew in front of Frank Hale, the same as everyone else, same amount, same care. He ate it. He didn't say anything. She didn't wait for him to. Pete Dunbar, on his second cup of coffee, said to nobody in particular, "Been a long time since I didn't dread coming inside." Nobody responded to that directly. But Roy Bassett refilled his own cup and sat back down instead of heading to the bunkhouse, and Petey started a slow story about something that had happened in town last spring, and the table stayed occupied for 40 minutes past the usual time. Margaret washed the pots and listened to the voices through the wall. She thought about what Dud had said. He's better at the land than the ledger. She thought about the ledger full of problems that were also opportunities, if you knew how to read them that way. She thought about Thomas, who had always said that the most expensive thing a person can do is not pay attention. Attention is free. Inattention costs everything. She rinsed the last pot and set it on the rack to dry, and she stood at the kitchen window for a moment and looked at the dark yard and the dark mountain behind it, and she thought, pay attention, keep paying attention. It was the one thing she'd never stop doing. It was turning out to be, as it always had been, the most useful thing she had. The snow came in the third week of November and didn't stop for 4 days. It wasn't the wet, heavy snow that comes early in a season and melts by afternoon. This was the real thing, fine and dry and driven sideways by wind that knew exactly where the gaps were in every wall, every door frame, every place where the building had settled and opened itself to the cold by a 1/4 inch. By the second morning, the yard was buried past the bottom fence rail, and the path between the main house and the barn had to be cleared twice a day or it disappeared. Margaret had prepared for it. Not because she'd known it was coming on that exact week, nobody did, but because she'd been at the ranch long enough now to understand that in this valley, winter didn't announce itself with particular courtesy, and the best response to that was to be ready before you needed to be. The larder was full. The woodpile was properly stacked and covered. The dry goods were inventoried and stored with the rotation method she'd implemented in the second week. Oldest in front, newest behind, nothing left open to moisture or cold air. The men had complained initially about the new system, which involved actually putting things back where they came from, a concept that had apparently not been part of the previous kitchen management. Now they did it without being told. That was the thing about systems Margaret had found over 58 years of building them. People grumble at the structure until the structure starts working for them, and then they forget they ever grumbled and simply use it. Human nature wasn't good or bad about this. It just was. The snowbound days inside had their own particular tension. 11 men confined to closer quarters than they were used to, the outdoor work reduced to the essentials: feeding and checking the animals, keeping the paths clear, watching the weather. Smaller tasks, less to exhaust the energy that would otherwise have found its outlet in the physical rhythm of the range. She watched it happen the way she'd watched it happen before, in other confined seasons. Small irritations becoming larger ones. A comment taken wrong. A card game that ended badly. Roy Bassett and a man named Carl getting into a shoving match over something nobody could clearly explain afterward, which she'd heard from the kitchen as a crash and 2 raised voices, and which had resolved itself before she got to the door of the dining room. Mostly because Pete Dunbar had stood up and told both of them to sit down in a tone that offered no alternative. She started a second supper rotation. Not a full meal, something between. 3 o'clock, she put something on the table. Not elaborate. Biscuits some days, a pot of something warm. Once an apple preserve she'd stretched from the last of the stored fruit with some dried spice she'd found in the back of the shelf, and which turned out to be far better than it had any right to be given what she had to work with. It gave the men something to organize their afternoon around. Gave them a reason to come inside, sit down briefly, then go back out with something warm in their stomachs, and a slight reset to the mood. Dud noticed it on the 3rd day. "You put food out at 3 now," he said. "I notice the afternoons are when things go sideways," she said. He looked at the table where 4 men were sitting eating biscuits and talking with something close to ease. Carl and Roy haven't spoken since Tuesday, he said. They were speaking just now, she said. Quietly, but they were. Dud watched them for a moment. You did that. The biscuits did it, she said. I just made the biscuits. He shook his head slowly, the way he'd been doing for 2 weeks now whenever he decided she was more than he'd thought, and went back out to check the barn. Cole was at the window when she went through the main room to return to the kitchen. He was looking at the snow in the yard with his hands in his coat pockets, the posture of a man doing math in his head that he didn't especially like the answers to. When does it usually break, she asked, because she still didn't know this valley's patterns the way he did. 3 or 4 days more, he said. This one's running normal. He paused. The mountain road to Caldwell might be passable by end of next week if nothing else comes in. I'll need to get an updated list to you before then, she said. There are 2 or 3 things I want to source before we're fully cut off. He turned from the window. I was going to talk to you about that. Something in his tone made her stop rather than continuing to the kitchen. About what? He moved to the desk that was now considerably cleaner than it had been 3 weeks ago, partially because she'd straightened it once while looking for a document, and partially because Cole, without announcing it, had started keeping it that way. And he pulled a letter from the top drawer. He held it for a second without opening it. That small hesitation told her something. This came in the last post before the snow, he said. I've been sitting on it for a few days. Sitting on it meaning you've read it and didn't like what it said, or sitting on it meaning you haven't opened it? Read it, he said, and didn't like what it said. He set it on the desk and left it there rather than handing it to her, which she understood as him not quite being ready to make it fully shared information yet. Victor Langley, he said. He's a railway investor out of the Eastern Capital. He's been buying up land debt in this territory for 2 years, putting together a corridor for a rail expansion west. She stood still. He's bought your debt, she said. Most of it. Cole's voice was level in the way of a man keeping it level on purpose. The note on the spring cattle purchase, the equipment loan from 2 years ago, the mortgage extension I took when Eleanor was sick. He paused on Eleanor's name, that slight pause that always accompanied it. He's got 3 of the 4 major notes on this ranch. How much total? $4,200. The number sat in the room. And the 4th note, she said? Still with the Caldwell Bank. Langley tried to buy it. I found that out through Gus at the bank, who told him no on principle because Gus has been doing business with my family for 30 years. He picked up the letter finally, looked at it. Langley's letter is polite, very polite. He says he wants to arrange a meeting to discuss repayment terms. Polite letters from men who've bought your debt in pieces rarely mean what they say, she said. No, Cole agreed. They don't. She came to the desk and he turned the letter toward her. She read it. It was, as he'd said, polite. It was also very carefully worded, the kind of careful wording that left no promises and no vulnerabilities. She set it back down. When does the largest note come due? February 15th. She looked at the window, at the snow. She did the arithmetic, not because she didn't already know the rough answer, but because she wanted to be sure before she said anything. What does he actually want? She said. Not the letter. What do you know about him? He wants the land, Cole said. The rail corridor they're surveying runs straight through the valley. He needs this stretch to connect the eastern line to the junction at Harwick Falls. If he owns the Harper land, he owns the route. And if you pay the notes, then he doesn't get it. But he's betting you can't. He'd be right to, Cole said quietly. She looked at him. He was standing with his hands in his pockets again, but not looking at the window now. Looking at the letter, which was also looking at the desk, which was also easier than looking at her while he said that. What are the ranch accounts at right now? She said. Before wages and supply costs for December? He did the number from memory, which told her he'd been running it often. 900 and change. She looked at the ceiling briefly, not praying, calculating. The Caldwell supplier dispute, she said. That 112 we documented. I haven't pursued it. That needs to happen as soon as the road opens. She turned to the window, thinking out loud now. The feed merchant renegotiation. What did you estimate that would save monthly? 12, maybe 15 if he comes down to market rate. Over 3 months, that's $35 to $45. She was moving the numbers. The duplicate equipment, What can actually be sold rather than kept? Cole looked at her. You want to sell equipment? I want to know what your storage barn has in it that you're not using and could convert to cash, she said. There's a difference between equipment you need and equipment you have. I haven't seen the full inventory. He was quiet for a moment. I'd have to go through it. We both should, she said. Soon. She pulled the blank paper that lived on the corner of the desk now and picked up the pencil. Don't make decisions tonight, she said. Let me run the full numbers first, not the rough version. Everything. Income projections through February, all expenditures, what's convertible, what's not. And if the numbers don't work, he said. She looked at him straight. Then we know exactly what we're short and we know it in time to think, rather than being surprised by it in February. That's better than not knowing. It wasn't hope she was offering him. She didn't have the numbers to offer him hope yet. What she was offering was attention and arithmetic, which was what she had, and which she'd found over the years to be underrated compared to hope, but more reliably useful. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. She started writing. She worked at the desk for 3 hours that evening after supper was done and cleaned up, and Cole came and went twice. Once to look over her shoulder at what she was writing, once to find the deed documents she asked for, which were in the second drawer under 2 years of unanswered mail circulars. She didn't comment on the circulars. She put them aside. Petey came in at 9 to bank the fire and found her still at the desk and gave her a look that had concern in it. You eaten anything since supper? He said. I had what was left in the pot. That was an hour before supper. She looked up. Then find me something from the kitchen, please. He brought her a slice of cornbread, and she ate it over the papers, which was not something she would have done with Thomas's freight ledgers because Thomas had a rule about food and paper, but Thomas wasn't here and the cornbread was already made and the numbers needed finishing. Around 10:30, she sat back. The numbers were not good. She had known they wouldn't be from the moment Cole told her the amount. But they were not, she found with some relief, impossible. There was a range, a thin, specific, unforgiving range, in which the thing could be done if everything went right and nothing went additionally wrong, and she knew from experience that something always went additionally wrong, which meant the margin needed to be wider than the minimum. She wrote the honest version at the bottom of the last page. Possible. Marginally. Requires everything. She left it on the desk for him. The snow broke on the 5th day as Cole had predicted. The road to Caldwell was impassable for another week after that, and during that week Margaret did 2 things that the ranch hands would talk about differently depending on who was telling the story. The first was the storage barn inventory. She and Cole spent a full afternoon going through it, and it was the first time she'd seen him genuinely uncomfortable. Not with her, but with what was in there. A man's accumulated evidence of years of good intentions that time had overtaken. Equipment purchased for projects that had gotten postponed. Replacement parts for machines that had been replaced themselves. A full cultivating rig that had been bought in a hopeful year for a crop expansion that had never happened. He stood looking at the cultivating rig for a moment. Eleanor thought we'd grow grain, he said, on the south field. She had the whole plan. Margaret looked at the rig. It was in decent condition, stored well, oiled before it went in. It's worth something to someone who's doing what she planned, she said carefully. He put his hand on the wheel of it briefly and then let it go. Yeah, he said. They cataloged everything without discussing that moment again, and the list Margaret produced afterward had a conservative cash value she presented to Cole the following morning. He looked at the number and then set the paper down carefully. That's $450, he said. Conservative, she said. The cultivating rig alone is worth $220 at current market. If you find the right buyer, and there's a buyer, there's a homestead family 3 miles east of Caldwell that's been trying to start a grain operation. I heard it mentioned in passing by Petey, who got it from the mail rider. Cole looked at her. You've been listening for this. I've been paying attention, she said. It's not the same as listening for something. It's just not ignoring things when they're useful. He looked at the list again. I don't want to strip the ranch, he said. You're not, she said. You're clearing what's already not working. There's a difference. She set her own copy of the list beside his. The equipment you actually use, the animals, the structures, None of that is on this page. He went through the list slowly. She let him. He crossed off 2 items, something he kept without explaining and she didn't ask him to, and handed it back. "All right," he said. "Let's see what it brings." The second thing that week was harder to account for. Frank Hale had been quieter since the incident with Jimmy's shoulder. Not friendly. Frank Hale's basic temperature was not friendly, and she doubted it ever had been. But quieter. Less inclined to make audible comments when she moved through the yard or the dining room. Less inclined to position himself in doorways when she needed to pass through them. She had noticed this without attaching too much to it. Men like Frank didn't change because someone proved them wrong once. They just recalculated their risk and adjusted their behavior accordingly. What she hadn't expected was the morning he came to the kitchen. Not to eat. It was mid-morning, past breakfast. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which was the one thing she'd never seen him do, and he looked at the corner of the room rather than at her. "My wife used to make something," he said. "For when the weather was bad. Some kind of hot drink. I don't know what was in it." She looked at him. His face was doing something difficult. "When did she die?" she said. He blinked. "What?" "Your wife." A pause. 3 years ago." "I'm sorry," she said. He shifted his weight. "I don't need—" "I know," she said. "What did it taste like?" "The drink." He struggled with the question more than it should have required. "Sweet, but not too sweet. Something warm in it. Spice, maybe." "Apple and cinnamon," she said. "Or something like it." "Maybe. I don't know." She turned to the stove without making it a production. "Sit down if you want. It'll take a few minutes." He sat. She didn't look at him while she worked, which she thought was the right instinct. Sometimes people needed the distance of not being observed while they were being helped. She made the drink from apple preserve, a small piece of cinnamon bark she'd found in the spice shelf, and hot water, and she added a little of the dried ginger that was in the back of the shelf because she had it and because it seemed right. She set it in front of him. He picked it up, drank, set it down. "That's not it," he said. But his voice had changed. "No," she said. "It never is." He sat there for a moment. Then he got up. "Thank you," he said to the surface of the table. "You're welcome," she said to the window. He went back out to work and she stood in the kitchen listening to the sound of his boots across the porch. And she thought about Thomas and about the accumulation of grief that people carry sideways into their behavior, all the anger that is really just loss wearing the wrong coat. And she thought that she probably could have hated Frank Hale for the last 3 weeks and been largely justified. But it would have cost her something she needed more than the satisfaction. Cole found out about it from Petey, who had been in the storage room adjacent to the kitchen and had heard the whole thing through the wall. She knew this because Cole appeared in the kitchen doorway that afternoon with a look on his face that she couldn't quite categorize. "Frank came in this morning," he said. "He did," she said. "Petey says you made him something." "I did." He looked at her. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said. "I'm not doing it because I have to." The look on his face didn't resolve into something she could categorize, so she stopped trying. What neither of them knew yet, standing in the kitchen doorway with the afternoon light coming low and cold through the window, was that the following morning would bring the road clear enough for a rider, and the rider would bring the mail, and in the mail would be a card, small, formal, printed on heavy stock, informing Cole Harper that Victor Langley would be arriving in the valley in 10 days' time and would appreciate the opportunity to meet in person regarding the notes in his possession. The card was polite. It was the most polite thing she would read all winter, and it meant the easy part was over. Cole read the card at breakfast, after everyone else had eaten and gone out. He set it on the table and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at Margaret, who had read it over his shoulder because she'd seen his face change when he opened the envelope, and she'd needed to know why. 10 days, he said. 10 days, she said. The road to Caldwell will be open in 3 days if this weather holds, he said. I need to deal with the supplier dispute. Start moving the equipment from the list. And the feed merchant. And the feed merchant. He picked up the card, looked at it again, set it down. He's going to come here with a lawyer, he said, and a number. And the number's going to be designed to feel like a way out while being a way in. Yes, she said. You know that without meeting him. I know what the card sounds like. She picked up her coffee cup. The question is what our number is going to be when he arrives. Not his, ours. Cole looked at her. Do we have a number? We will, she said. Give me the rest of the week. He nodded. He picked up the card one more time and then put it in his coat pocket. And that small gesture, the pocket instead of the desk, the body instead of the paper, told her more than anything he'd said. He was carrying it personally, the way you carry something that feels like it might be the end of something. She understood that feeling. She'd been carrying something like it for 8 months. The difference was what you did with the carrying. She went back to the numbers. She spent the next 3 days at the desk and the kitchen table, and once, when the light was best in the late afternoon, at the small bench inside the barn door where Cole sometimes sat to go over the day's work. Anywhere the figures were visible and the thinking was clear. She was not building an argument. She was building a picture. The difference mattered. An argument could be knocked down by a better argument, but a picture of what was actually true was just the truth, and the truth had the advantage of being something you could navigate by even when it wasn't what you wanted to see. On the 5th day, she went to Cole. He was in the paddock working with one of the horses, a young chestnut mare that was giving him trouble over something. She stood at the fence until he noticed her and came over. I need to show you something, she said. He climbed over the fence and she walked him back to the house and sat him down at the desk and put the pages in front of him. This is the honest picture, she said. Everything we have, everything we owe, everything that's liquid and everything that isn't. The range at the bottom is the gap, the minimum we need between now and February 15th and the maximum we can reasonably expect to generate. He looked at the pages. He took his time. The gap is $400, he said, approximately. Give or take the supplier settlement and how fast the equipment sells. That's the gap between what we can put together and what he's owed. Yes. He sat back, ran his hand over his jaw the way he did when he was thinking something through. What happens if we can't close the gap? He said. She looked at him steadily. Then Langley arrives with the legal right to demand immediate full payment, which you can't make, which gives him the option to call the notes due, which means he can move on foreclosure. And he will. A man who bought your debt in pieces specifically to get this land? Yes, he will. Cole looked at the window. The mountain was gray today, snow on the upper face but not the lower, and the valley was brown and frost-hard and very quiet. I built this ranch back up from nothing after my father died, he said. He left it with 2 notes and 3 good horses, and I was 26 years old. He paused. I can't lose it. There was nothing performing in the statement. He said it the way you say a true thing that you haven't needed to say out loud before. You haven't lost it, she said. $400, Margaret. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She wasn't sure he noticed. There are things we haven't tried yet, she said. The Caldwell settlement might come faster than we estimated. The equipment, I want to talk to someone about the cultivating rig specifically before Langley gets here, because if we can move that piece at the right price, it closes half the gap by itself. He looked at her. Something in his face had the specific quality of a man trying to decide if he's being offered something real or something meant to make him feel better. She understood the difference mattered to him. It mattered to her too. I'm not telling you it's certain, she said. I'm telling you the gap is $400, and I know what $400 looks like, and it's not nothing, but it's also not 4,000. There's a distance between where we are and impossible, and I'd like to use the time between now and Langley's arrival to close as much of it as we can before we find out what we're actually dealing with. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the mare he'd been working with made a sound in the paddock, and one of the other horses answered her. All right, Cole said. She stood and gathered the papers. Write me a letter of introduction to the Caldwell merchant. I want to go with you when the road opens. If I'm the one who presents the account discrepancy, it changes the dynamic. He looked up from the desk. Why? Because I'm not you, she said. He'll try to negotiate differently with you than he will with a woman who has the figures laid out in columns and knows exactly where his shortfall is. Men like that underestimate the person with the columns. She paused. I'm used to being underestimated. I know how to use it. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I'll write the letter tonight. She nodded and went back to the kitchen, and the afternoon went on, and somewhere on the other side of the mountain pass, 10 days away, Victor Langley was no doubt in a warm office, looking at a map of this valley, and thinking about rail corridors and land values and a ranch whose owner he'd never expected to be a serious obstacle. He didn't know about the woman in the kitchen. Nobody who underestimated Margaret Ashford ever did, until it was too late to recalculate. The road to Caldwell opened on a Thursday, which gave them 7 days before Langley's arrival. Cole had the wagon ready before Margaret finished breakfast. She came out to find it hitched and loaded with the 2 smaller pieces of equipment from the list: a post-hole digger in good condition and a grain auger that had been used twice and stored correctly. And Cole standing at the horse's head with his coat buttoned and his expression set in the way of a man who has decided something and doesn't want to be talked out of it. She climbed up without comment. He handed her the leather satchel she'd prepared the night before: figures, invoices, the documented discrepancy laid out in the clean columns she'd spent 2 evenings on, and she set it on her lap and they went. The road was passable, but not comfortable. The thaw had softened the ruts and the wagon rocked badly in the low places, and twice Cole had to take a line around a muddy section that had the look of a spot that would swallow a wheel if you tried it direct. She held the satchel and said nothing and watched the valley floor widen as they came down out of the ranch land toward town. "Who are we seeing first?" she said. "Merchant or the bank?" "Merchant," she said. "The bank I can handle in an hour. The merchant will take longer if he decides to argue." "He'll argue," Cole said. "Warren Stills has been arguing professionally for 30 years. "Good," she said. "I prefer when people argue. It means they're engaged." Cole glanced at her sideways. "That's an unusual way to look at it. When someone goes quiet in a dispute, they're either surrendering or planning something worse," she said. "Arguing means they're still trying to win the normal way." He thought about that for a moment and then nodded, which was his version of acknowledging a point. Warren Stills operated out of a low building on the main street of Caldwell that had general merchandise and provisions painted in letters that had once been red and were now a color that no longer had a name. He was 55, broad across the shoulders, with the confident posture of a man who'd been the largest supplier in a small market long enough to stop considering that anyone might know something he didn't. He came out from behind the counter when Cole walked in and shook his hand with the warmth of someone who expected to control the conversation. Then he looked at Margaret. "Mrs. Ashford," she said. "I manage accounts for Harper Ranch." Something shifted in Still's expression. Not hostility, more like the slight recalibration of a man who'd prepared for one kind of meeting and found himself in a different one. "Well," he said, with a smile that was doing a lot of work. "Always glad to see the people behind the numbers." "I imagine," she said. "Could we use the table in the back?" He looked at Cole. Cole nodded. The back table was where Stills did his serious conversations, which meant it had the quality of a space designed to make the other party feel like a guest in the merchant's own territory. A chair slightly lower on the far side, the window at Stills' back so the light was in the visitor's face. Margaret had been in rooms like this before. She sat down and opened the satchel and spread the papers on the table facing her, not facing Stills, and pulled her chair forward so the table edge was where she wanted it. "I'll start," she said, "by saying that Harper Ranch values its relationship with your establishment, and we're here today to resolve a discrepancy, not to make accusations." Stills settled back. "I appreciate that approach. The past 6 months of invoices show charges for grade A smoked pork across 14 deliveries," she said. "The product received across those deliveries was, by weight and quality assessment, grade B. The premium difference between grade A and grade B at current regional market rates is 11 cents per pound." She put the first page in front of him. "At the logged weights, that's an overcharge of $64.30. Stills looked at the page. His face did not change, which was itself a kind of information. "Additionally," she said, putting the second page beside the first, "the logged delivery weights across 8 of those 14 deliveries do not align with the remaining inventory weights I was able to calculate from usage records. The shortfall across those 8 deliveries totals approximately 41 pounds. She looked at him. "At grade A prices you charged, that's an additional discrepancy of $12.80. Stills looked at both pages. His jaw moved slightly. "Mrs. Ashford," he said in a measured tone, "weights can vary with transport conditions, yet settling, moisture." "Yes," she said, "which is why I used a conservative figure rather than a precise one, and why I've documented only the 8 deliveries where the shortfall was above the range of reasonable transport variance." She put her finger on the column of numbers. "These 8 are outside that range." A silence. "I need to review my own records," he said. "Of course," she said. "We can wait." She folded her hands on the table. Cole, sitting beside her, said nothing. She'd told him on the ride down that his job in this meeting was to be present and let her work. And to his credit, he'd agreed without making it difficult. Stills went behind the counter and spent 10 minutes with his ledger. She could hear pages turning. Once, a pause that went longer than the others. She looked at her own figures and waited. He came back. "I can acknowledge a discrepancy," he said, sitting down, "though I'd put the figure closer to $60 total, not $77. "I'd expect you to put it closer to 60, she said pleasantly. "The difference is in how we account for the transport variance. If you'd like to go through the specific deliveries I've flagged, I can show you exactly how I calculated the range I excluded." He looked at her for a moment. "That won't be necessary," he said. "What is it you're proposing?" "A credit of $77.10 against future orders," she said. "Applied immediately. Additionally, the ranch's next 3 supply orders will be invoiced at Grade B pricing unless I personally verify the incoming product is Grade A." "That's a significant... It's what the documentation supports," she said, "and it keeps the business relationship intact, which I think is valuable to both of us." She paused. "The alternative is to present what I have to the Merchants Association in Caldwell, which I understand meets monthly. I'd rather not do that. It's more paperwork for everyone." Another silence. Stills looked at Cole, who looked back at him with an expression of polite neutrality. $77, Stills said, "and the verification arrangement on the next 3 orders." He picked up the papers. He looked at them one more time, and she watched him do the calculation she knew he was doing. How much this cost versus what it cost to fight it, versus what a Merchants Association inquiry would cost in reputation and time. "Done," he said. He signed the credit agreement she'd drafted the night before, which she'd brought already prepared because she'd thought it probable they'd reach an agreement, and it was better to have the paper ready than to give him overnight to reconsider. Outside on the street, Cole walked to the wagon and then stopped and looked back at her. "You had the paper ready," he said. "I had the paper ready," she confirmed. He looked at the building, then at her. "When you said you preferred arguing, he was never going to go all the way to the Merchants Association," she said. "That was the room for negotiation, but he needed to believe I would." She adjusted the satchel strap. "Bank next?" He looked at her for another second. "Bank next," he said. The bank took 40 minutes and went as she'd expected. Gus Hellman, who had indeed known Cole's family for 30 years, was inclined to help but limited in what he could do. He confirmed that Langley had attempted to purchase the 4th note and that he had declined on the basis of his existing relationship with the Harper family. He also confirmed, carefully, that Langley had connections in the territorial capital that made him a serious and legally sophisticated operator. "He'll bring documentation," Gus said. "Everything in order. Langley doesn't make technical mistakes." "I know," Margaret said. "We're not planning to find technical mistakes." Gus looked at her. "What are you planning?" "To pay," she said. "As much as we can, in a way that makes him understand that the next payment will also come." Gus nodded slowly. "And if the amount falls short? Then we need some time," she said. "Is there anything the bank can do on the 4th note, extend the term, adjust the schedule, that would reduce the immediate cash pressure?" He considered it. "I can give you another 60 days on the payment schedule for the 4th note. That's within my authority. It doesn't solve the Langley problem, but it does free up what you would have paid in January." "How much?" $140. She looked at Cole. He was doing the math. "That helps?" she said. "Yes." Outside again, the afternoon was going gray and cold, and the wind off the mountain had a purpose to it. 140 from the bank extension, Cole said, walking beside her. 77 from the credit. That's 217. He paused. We still need the equipment money, and we're still short of the full amount. The cultivating rig, she said. Where's the Homestead family Petey mentioned, the ones looking to start grain? East of Caldwell, like you said. They filed a claim 8 months ago. Name's Abernathy. Can we find them today? He looked at the sky, assessing the light. If we go now? They found the Abernathy homestead 4 miles east of town on a claim that was ambitious and under-resourced in the way that most new homestead claims were. The land was good, the family was working hard, and the gap between those two things was filled with a kind of determined optimism that Margaret recognized and respected because she'd seen it in a lot of people who'd eventually made something real. Solomon Abernathy was 32, with a wife named Clara, who stood at the door of the claim house with a child on her hip and assessed Margaret and Cole with the quiet alertness of a woman who'd learned to read strangers quickly. Cole introduced himself and explained the cultivating rig. Solomon Abernathy looked interested and guarded at the same time, which was the correct way to look when a man came offering to sell you something. What's the condition? He said. Used twice, Cole said. Stored properly. I can show you the original purchase invoice. What are you asking? Cole glanced at Margaret. $210, she said, which is below the current merchant price in Caldwell by $40, and you're welcome to verify that. We want it to go to someone who'll use it. Solomon Abernathy looked at his wife. Clara Abernathy looked at Margaret with an expression that was reassessing something. We'd want to see it first, Clara said. Of course, Margaret said. We can arrange for you to come to the ranch, or we can bring it to you. Whatever works for your family. Clara looked at her for another moment. You manage the accounts, you said. I do. How long have you been at Harper Ranch? About a month. Clara Abernathy nodded slowly, the nod of a woman recognizing something without needing to name it. Solomon, she said, we want to see the rig. They arranged it for the following Saturday. On the drive back, the light was going fast and the road had refrozen in the dropping temperature, which made the wagon knock and pull, and Cole drove with his attention on the horse, and Margaret sat with the satchel and the numbers. If Abernathy buys, she said, and the credit from Stills and the bank extension, we're short about $40, Cole said. Maybe $35 if the other small pieces from the list sell. We need to sell them before Langley arrives, she said. Is there a buyer in Caldwell? Hardware merchant might take the auger, post hole digger, maybe the livery. Then we do that tomorrow, she said. Go back in. He was quiet for a moment. That's 2 days in Caldwell. I know. The ranch needs... Dud can manage 2 days, she said, and Petey knows the kitchen routine well enough to hold it together. This matters more right now. He was quiet again, and she could hear him working through the same thing she was. The calculation of what could be put off and what couldn't, the arithmetic of priority that is different from regular arithmetic because it has a human cost built into every variable. All right, he said. The hardware merchant took the auger at $40, which was 10 less than she'd hoped and 15 more than he'd opened with. The livery took the post hole digger at $22. Combined with the credit from Stills and the bank extension, they were carrying numbers that were still short of $4,200 by a distance that made her stomach tighten when she wrote it down honestly. But they had 5 days left, and she had one more idea. She brought it to Cole that evening, back at the ranch, at the desk after supper. The duplicate orders, she said. The equipment that was ordered twice in September, Sergi, the fencing supplies. He looked at the inventory page. We have twice what we need. The Abernathy homestead is fencing their south boundary this spring, she said. I know this because Clara Abernathy mentioned it while you and Solomon were talking about the rig. They're going to need posts and wire. She looked at him. We can sell them half our fencing supply at cost, which is better than what they'd pay in Caldwell, and which converts supplies we'd never use into cash. Cole stared at the page. That's... He ran the figures. At cost, that's $60. 63, she said. He sat back in the chair. She watched his face move through the math and come out the other side at something that was close to belief but hadn't quite reached it yet. If Abernathy buys the rig Saturday, he said slowly, and the fencing supply. We're within $12 to $15 of the full amount, she said, which is a gap that the remaining small items on the list can close, or that the Abernathy deal itself might close if we negotiate the transport into the price. He was looking at her. The lamp on the desk threw a steady light across the papers between them, and she could see him clearly, could see the thing in his face that had been in it since the card from Langley arrived, but was now, for the first time, sitting slightly differently. $12 to $15, he said. Approximately. I want to be careful about the approximately, because something always goes additionally wrong. She looked at him. Yes. You said that before, when we first looked at the numbers. It's still true. He nodded. He picked up the page with her figures and looked at it for a moment. My father used to say that a ranch doesn't fail because of one bad year, he said. He said it fails because of 100 small bad decisions that nobody noticed. He set the page down. I've been making small bad decisions for 3 years. She didn't argue with him because he was right, and he knew he was right, and what he needed was an absolution for it. The decisions are being corrected, she said. That's what matters now. He looked at her across the desk. I want to ask you something, he said. All right? When Langley comes, and he's going to come with a lawyer and documents and whatever argument he thinks closes the door on us, I want you there. She looked at him. In what capacity? In the capacity of the person who understands these numbers better than anyone else in this valley, he said. And the person who, when someone comes at her with something official-looking and politely worded, doesn't fold. She thought about Warren Stills and the table with the bad chair angle and the window at his back. I'll be there, she said. Saturday came cold and clear, which was its own kind of mercy. Solomon and Clara Abernathy arrived at the ranch in their farm wagon at 9 in the morning, both of them, with the child and an older girl Margaret hadn't seen before. Clara Abernathy was the kind of woman who brought her whole family to a business meeting because the whole family was the business, and Margaret respected that without needing to say so. Cole showed them the cultivating rig in the storage barn. Solomon walked around it 3 times, crouched down to look at the wheel connections, tested the adjustment mechanism, looked at the blade angles. Clara watched her husband and also watched Cole, and also, Margaret noticed, watched her. It's in better condition than I expected, Solomon said finally, for a piece that's been sitting. It was oiled before storage, Cole said. My wife's idea. She was careful about equipment. A small silence. 210, Solomon said. That's firm? Cole looked at Margaret. That's where we start, she said. We also have fencing supply. Posts and wire, half a barn's worth, priced at $63, which is below the Caldwell merchant rate. If you take both together, we can bring the rig to your claim with our wagon at no additional cost. Clara looked at her husband. Solomon Abernathy was the kind of man who wanted to negotiate on principle. She could see that, and she let him have a moment of silence to do it internally. 202 on the rig, he said. 63 on the fencing, transport included. She looked at him steadily. 208 on the rig. The fencing stands at 63 because it's already below market. Transport included. Another silence. Solomon looked at Clara. Clara gave him the small nod of a woman who has already done the math and found it acceptable. Done, Solomon said. They shook hands in the yard, and Margaret stood to the side while Cole and Solomon worked out the delivery schedule, and Clara Abernathy came and stood beside her. You've done this kind of thing before, Clara said. It wasn't a question. A long time ago, Margaret said. How long have you actually been at this ranch? A month and a few days. Clara looked at her sideways. And in a month and a few days, you know the inventory, the supplier accounts, the market rates, and what my husband needs for his south boundary fence? I pay attention, Margaret said. Clara was quiet for a moment. The cold air moved between them. The older girl was running in the yard, and the child on Clara's hip was watching Cole with the focused stare of a small child encountering a tall man for the first time. My mother used to say that the most dangerous thing in any room is an underestimated woman, Clara said. Your mother was right, Margaret said. They looked at each other, and something passed between them that was not friendship yet, but was the material from which friendship is made. With the Abernathy deal settled, Margaret sat down that evening and wrote the final column. Revenue from stills credit, $77.10. Bank extension on fourth note, $140 freed from January. Auger to hardware merchant, $40. Post hole digger to livery, $22. Cultivating rig to Abernathy, $208. Fencing supply to Abernathy, $63. She added the column twice, then a third time because the number surprised her enough that she wanted to be sure. Total available against Langley's notes, $4,231. She set the pencil down. The number she needed was $4,200 exactly. She sat for a moment with the $31 surplus in her head, $31 between where they'd been 6 weeks ago and where they were now. And she thought about the bench at Caldwell Station and the grain she'd picked from the freight platform floor and the cold that had found every gap in that old building. And she thought about how a margin this thin should feel terrifying. It didn't. It felt like what it was, enough. She brought the final page to Cole. He was on the porch, which surprised her because it was cold, and he was standing with his arms on the rail looking at the dark yard and the dark barn and the mountains beyond that were shapes against a slightly lighter dark sky. She handed him the page without saying anything. He took it. He read the column. He went still. Not the still of a man shutting down, but the still of a man absorbing something that is asking his whole body to hold it. $31 over, he said. Yes. He looked at the page again. How? Attention and arithmetic, she said. And a homestead family that needed what you didn't. He looked at the mountain. He didn't say anything for a while, and she didn't say anything either, because the moment didn't need words. And she'd learned long ago that filling silence with words, because you couldn't stand the silence, was one of the small bad habits that costs you things. Langley comes Tuesday, he said finally. Yes. He's going to walk in here expecting to own this land. Yes. And we're going to put $4,200 on a desk in front of him. Yes, she said, in the railway office, public and witnessed, which is the right way to do it. He turned and looked at her. The porch light was behind him, and she couldn't read his face clearly, but she could read the quality of the silence before he spoke. What made you think of the fencing supply? He said. Clara Abernathy mentioned the south boundary while you weren't listening, she said. I was. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was related to one. $31, he said again. If something goes wrong between now and Tuesday, we have $31 of room for it, she said. And if something goes very wrong, then we handle it when it happens, she said, the way you handle everything that can't be planned for in advance. He looked at her for a moment more. Come inside, he said. It's cold. She went inside, and the fire was going, and Petey had left coffee on the stove, and she poured 2 cups because there were 2 people who'd earned one. And she set his on the table without comment, and he sat down and she sat across from him, and neither of them said much because there wasn't much that needed saying. In 2 days, Victor Langley was coming, and for the first time since the card arrived in the mail, Margaret Ashford was not afraid of that. She was, in fact, ready. Tuesday came in clear and bitter cold, the kind of morning that makes the air feel thin and every sound carry farther than it should. Margaret was up at 4:30, not because she'd set herself to wake, she simply did, the way she always did before something that mattered. She lay on the cot for a few minutes, listening to the ranch settle around her, the creak of the walls in the cold, the distant sound of one of the horses moving in the barn, and then she got up and dressed carefully because that too was part of it. Not for Langley, for herself. She made breakfast for 11 men, and she made it well, the same as every other morning, because the day required steadiness, and steadiness is a practice, not a mood. You don't become steady when you need to be. You are steady because you've been practicing it every ordinary day that came before. The men ate. Dud Greer drank his coffee standing up, the way he did when he was thinking hard about something. You nervous? He asked her quietly when the others had drifted out. No, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Liar, he said, but not unkindly. She considered it. Prepared, she said. The feeling might look similar from the outside. He nodded. He set his cup in the wash basin. For what it's worth, he said, and then he stopped and she waited, and he said, I was wrong about you from the first day. I know, she said. That doesn't bother you? People are wrong about me fairly often, she said. I'd wear myself out being bothered by it. He made the sound that, over 6 weeks, she'd come to understand was his laugh. Cole came through at 7, already in his good coat. Not a formal coat, he didn't own one, but the wool coat that was better than the working one. And he looked at her with a question in his face that she answered before he asked it. Everything is ready, she said. The papers are in the satchel. I want to leave by 9 to get to the railway office before he does. He'll be on the 10 o'clock from the Eastern line, Cole said. His message said that. Then we want to be there at 9:30, she said. The room matters. Where you're standing when someone walks in matters. He looked at her. You've done something like this before. Not exactly like this, she said, but close enough. He nodded and went to find his hat. The railway office at Caldwell Station was a single room that served multiple functions: ticket sales in the morning, administrative business in the afternoon, a meeting space when the station master, a careful man named Oliver Pruitt, decided a matter was significant enough to warrant it. She had spoken to Pruitt the day before, explained the nature of what was happening in terms precise enough to make him understand and general enough not to alarm him, and he had agreed to make the room available and to be present himself as a witness. He was there when they arrived, the room swept, and the small wood stove going so it was warm. 2 chairs on the visitor side of the desk, 1 on the station master's side, a small side table where she placed the satchel. You'll want to sit at the desk, she said to Pruitt. This is your house. He appreciated that. She could tell. Cole stood at the window, the same window, she realized, where she'd watched that sparrow work the freight platform on the morning they'd met. The platform looked different now with an inch of snow on it, but the bones were the same. At 10:47, which was not 10 o'clock, Victor Langley walked through the door. She'd formed a picture of him from Cole's description and from what she'd read in the card. A picture of a particular kind of man, the kind who moves through the world with the confidence of someone who has never needed to wonder whether he belongs in the room. She'd been right about that. He was 50, perhaps, with silver at his temples and a coat that had been tailored rather than bought off a rack. His lawyer was behind him, younger, with a leather case and the expression of a man who'd been told this meeting was a formality. Langley's eyes went to Cole first, then to Pruitt, then to her, briefly, and away, the way eyes move past furniture. Harper, he said, crossing the room with his hand extended. Good to finally put a face to the correspondence. Cole shook his hand. Mr. Langley, I appreciate you making the trip to town. Langley looked around the room with the pleasant authority of a man deciding how to arrange things. I thought we might have this conversation at your ranch, actually see the land, but the railway office seemed more appropriate, Cole said, given the nature of the business. Langley smiled. Of course. He gestured at his lawyer. This is Edward Marsh, my legal counsel. He has the documentation. Shall we sit? Pruitt said, with the slightly formal tone of a man who'd decided to take his role seriously. They sat, Langley and Marsh on one side of the desk, Cole and Margaret on the other, Pruitt at the head. Langley's gaze moved to Margaret again. This time he let it land. I don't believe we've been introduced, he said. Margaret Ashford, she said. I manage accounts for Harper Ranch. A small pause. Something moved behind Langley's eyes, a quick reassessment that he covered smoothly with a courteous nod. Mrs. Ashford, he said. I wasn't aware Mr. Harper had brought on an account manager. He hadn't needed one before, she said pleasantly. Circumstances change. Marsh was opening the leather case. He produced a document, several pages, bound, the kind of document that has been prepared by someone who knows what they're doing, and placed it on the desk. The notes in Mr. Langley's possession, Marsh said. 3 instruments, as documented. The spring cattle purchase note, the equipment loan, and the mortgage extension, all current in their terms, all properly transferred to Mr. Langley's holding. The total due on February 15th is $4,200. Yes, Margaret said. We're aware of the amount. Langley leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man watching something proceed exactly as planned. She knew that ease. She'd seen it in worn stills before the pages came out of the satchel. "I want to say, before we discuss terms," Langley said, "that I have a great deal of respect for what you've built here, Harper. This valley is something. It's exactly because this is exceptional land that I've invested in being part of its future." Cole said nothing. She'd told him on the drive over, let Langley talk. Let him say the things he's planned to say. Don't interrupt the performance because people who are performing don't listen while they're performing, and you want him listening when the moment matters. "I think there are options here that serve everyone," Langley continued. "I'm not here to take land. I'm here to be a partner in its development." "What kind of options?" Cole said. "The rail expansion through this valley is coming regardless," Langley said. "The question is whether Harper Ranch is part of that future or in the way of it. If we can reach an agreement today, a reasonable arrangement on the land that the rail corridor requires, a right-of-way with fair compensation, the notes become a very different conversation." There it was. She'd known it was coming, but hearing it stated clearly was still its own kind of thing. Cole looked at the desk. "You want the South Corridor." "A right-of-way through the south portion of the property," Langley said. 300 acres. In exchange, I restructure the notes on favorable terms. Extended period, reduced rate, and the rail access itself increases the value of your remaining land considerably. He said it smoothly. It was a good offer, in the way a trap with comfortable cushioning is a good trap. 300 acres is a quarter of the ranch, Cole said. The least productive quarter, Langley said, with the confidence of a man who'd had someone assess it. The south grazing area. You retain the prime land. The south grazing carries 200 head through winter, Cole said. It's not unproductive. Langley tilted his head graciously. I understand the sentiment. It's not sentiment, Cole said. It's a number. A slight pause. Langley looked at Cole with the recalibrated attention of someone who'd expected less. Margaret opened the satchel. Mr. Langley, she said, we appreciate the offer and we understand the reasoning behind it. However, we're not here to negotiate a right-of-way. She placed the payment document on the desk. It was her document. She'd drafted it with the same care she'd given every page in the satchel, and it was on clean paper with a clean hand, and every figure was correct. We're here to satisfy the notes in full, she said. Langley looked at the document. His expression did not change, which was impressive, and also told her she'd hit something he hadn't expected. The full amount, she said, $4,200, documentation of payment, return of the original instruments, and a release in full of any claim arising from those notes. She looked at him steadily. Mr. Pruitt is here to witness the transaction. A silence. Marsh leaned toward Langley and said something quietly. Langley listened without moving his eyes from Margaret. That's a considerable sum to have assembled by February, Langley said. His voice was still smooth, but something underneath it had changed its position. It is, she agreed. It took some work. May I ask how? The ranch's accounts were reorganized, she said. Supplier discrepancies were corrected. Redundant inventory was converted. Operational expenses were reduced to accurate market rates. She paused. The ranch was losing money in places that didn't require losing it. Once those were addressed, the picture changed. Langley looked at the document, then at her, then at Cole. You did all this, he said to Cole. In, what, 2 months? Less, Cole said. Langley picked up the payment document. He read it. He was thorough. She'd expected that. And he was looking for something wrong with it, which she'd also expected. She'd given him nothing wrong to find. He set it down. You understand, he said carefully, that this satisfies the notes, but the rail expansion plans don't change. The corridor survey has already been filed. There will be other conversations about right-of-way as the project develops. That may be, Margaret said. But those will be conversations about fair compensation for a ranch that carries no debt, which is a very different conversation from this one. Marsh looked at his case. Langley looked at the document. She sat and waited and let the room do its work, because a room will do your work for you if you've set it up correctly and then have the patience to let it run. Langley counted the money. Cole had brought it in an envelope. Not dramatic, not a stack of coins on the desk, just an envelope the way any payment is an envelope. Langley's lawyer counted it first, stacking it in columns. Then Langley counted it himself. The sound of money being counted in a quiet room is a specific sound, and she sat through it without moving, with her hands folded on the satchel. Langley counted it twice. Then he set it down. $4,200, Marsh said. Yes, Margaret said. As documented. Marsh signed the release. Langley signed it after, with the pen Prewitt produced from his desk, and the scratch of it on paper was the sound she'd been working toward for 6 weeks, and it was not dramatic. It was just a sound. Prewitt witnessed it. She took her copy. Cole took his. Langley stood. He buttoned his coat very precisely, the way a man manages his hands when he wants them to do something they aren't going to do. "You're a capable woman, Mrs. Ashford," he said. It was the most neutral compliment that phrase has ever been used to give. "Thank you," she said, without warmth or cold. Just acknowledgement. He looked at Cole. "Harper." "Langley." He left. Marsh followed him with the case. The door closed. Prewitt sat back in his chair and let out a breath. "Well," he said. "Thank you, Oliver," she said, "for the room and the witness." "My pleasure," he said, and she could tell from his face that he meant it rather more than the phrase usually implies. Outside, in the cold of the station platform, Cole stood beside her and looked at the document in his hand. The release. His name on it, and Langley's name on it, and Prewitt's name as witness, and the date in the corner, the 15th of February. And it was done. She watched him read it a second time, and then a third, the way you read something you don't quite believe in yet. "It's real," she said. "I know," he said, but he read it one more time. The drive back was quieter than the drives to Caldwell had been, which was its own kind of language. Not uncomfortable quiet, settled quiet, the kind that comes after something has resolved itself and doesn't need discussing yet because the discussion will come in its own time. About a mile from the ranch, Cole said, "What happens now?" She looked at the road. "The feed merchant contract comes up for renewal in April. We renegotiate it then." She paused. "The Abernathy delivery needs to be scheduled. And you're still short 2 ranch hands for spring work, the seasonal men you let go in February." He glanced at her. "That's not what I meant." She looked at him. He was watching the road, but his jaw had the angle it got when he was saying something that cost him something. "I mean, what happens with you?" he said. "You came for the winter." "I came because you needed someone," she said. "I still need someone," he said. "The ranch still needs—" He stopped, started over. "What I'm asking badly is whether you want to stay." The question sat in the cold air between them. She thought about the bench at Caldwell Station, about the carpet bag and the 2 nights of cold and the grain from the freight platform, about the rented room and the letter from the bank and the long 8 months of being a person that the world had temporarily stopped having a use for. She thought about the kitchen at 4 in the morning and the ledger full of numbers that had turned out to be solvable, and Dud Greer's version of a laugh, and Petey's gap-toothed grin, and Jimmy Crane's face when the shoulder went back into place, and Clara Abernathy at the door of the claim house reading her in the first 10 seconds. She thought about Thomas, who she would carry for the rest of her life, and who she was, she understood, allowed to carry without it, meaning she couldn't also be here. "I want to stay," she said. He nodded. Once, the way he nodded when something settled. "I should tell you," he said, "that I'm not easy to live around. I know that about myself." "I've noticed," she said. The corner of his mouth turned. "And?" "I'm not particularly easy either," she said. "I move furniture without asking. I read other people's accounts without being invited. I'm right about numbers more often than is comfortable." "I've noticed," he said. They drove the last mile in the comfortable quiet of 2 people who have just told each other a true thing and found it received without damage. That evening, the ranch had a gathering that no one had officially planned, and everyone seemed to arrive at naturally. Dud had gotten word somehow, through Petey probably, who seemed to function as the ranch's information system. And when Cole and Margaret drove in from Caldwell, there was already smoke from both chimneys and the smell of something cooking that wasn't her doing. Roy Bassett had made an attempt at cornbread. It was imperfect in the way of something made by a person who'd watched someone else do it and thought they had the general idea. She didn't say anything about the cornbread, She put out the soup she'd made that morning before they left, which was better than Roy's cornbread in every technical sense. And she let them exist together on the table and let the meal be what it was, imperfect and collective and warm. Cole told them it was done, and he was brief about it the way he was brief about most things that mattered to him, and the room did the thing she'd seen it do before at this table, that collective release of held breath that looks like nothing dramatic but is actually people deciding to believe something. Frank Hale, at the end of the table, said good and went back to eating, and she found that this was, in its own way, the best response in the room. Pete Dunbar raised his coffee cup. He didn't say anything. He just raised it. And around the table, the others raised theirs, including Petey, who was still holding a fork, and including Dud, who was standing in the doorway because he'd been in and out all evening checking something in the barn that she suspected didn't need checking as much as he needed somewhere to put his emotion. Cole raised his cup last. He looked at her across the table. She raised hers. That was all. That was the celebration. After, while she was washing the pots, the same pots she'd washed the first evening, in this same kitchen, the first night she'd had a room with a door that latched, she thought about what it takes to rebuild a life. The answer she kept returning to was smaller than she'd have expected before she'd done it herself. It doesn't take a dramatic moment or a second chance handed to you by someone generous. Those help when they come. But the real material is smaller and more ordinary, the ability to look at what is actually in front of you instead of what you wish was there. The willingness to be useful even when useful is all you can be. The decision, made fresh each morning, to pay attention. She had not been saved. She wanted to be clear about that in her own mind. Cole Harper had asked her a question at a train station, which was a practical question about a practical need, and she had answered honestly and gotten on a wagon, and everything after that was the consequence of continuing to do the next thing that needed doing. That was all. That was, she thought, enough of an explanation for everything. Thomas had always said she was better at the work than she gave herself credit for. She'd spent 40 years thinking he was being kind. She understood now that he'd been being accurate, which was different, and she thought she might have finally stopped needing the distinction explained. She dried the last pot and hung it on the rack. Spring came, as it always does, on its own schedule and with no particular regard for what you'd been through in the winter before it. The snow receded up the mountain by April, and the valley floor came back to itself, the brown of the frost-dead grass giving way to something that wasn't quite green yet but was trying. Cole rode out in the mornings to check the south grazing, and she could see from the kitchen window the far shape of him moving through the lowland, and it was a picture she'd grown used to without deciding to. The Abernathy fence went up on the south claim in March, with the posts and wire from Harper Ranch, and Clara came by one afternoon while Solomon was working the new rig, which moved through their intended field with the sound of something finally doing what it was built to do, and sat in the kitchen with Margaret and drank coffee and talked about things that had nothing to do with business, which was how Clara had decided to indicate she wanted to be friends. Margaret had accepted this. Dud renegotiated the feed contract in April. She'd prepared for it, and he'd gone and done it, and he'd gotten the rate within $2 of what she'd projected, and he'd come back and told her the number and waited with the expression of a man hoping to be told he'd done well. "That's within $2 of market rate," she said. "Is that good?" "That's very good," she said. "The man's a stubborn negotiator." Dud put his hat back on and went out, and she heard him in the yard a few minutes later telling Pete Dunbar something she couldn't make out, and Pete's voice answering, and then the sound of both of them moving off toward the barn. Jimmy Crane's shoulder had healed correctly, which she'd expected but had kept quiet about expecting until it was confirmed by the fact that he was back to full work in March, with no limitation. He'd come to her in February, 2 weeks into his recovery, and asked if she'd taught him what she'd done. "Why?" she'd asked. "Because the next time somebody gets hurt out here, it might be you," he said, "or someone when you're not around." She had looked at him for a moment. He was 19 and he'd said a practical and somewhat profound thing, and she didn't make too much of it because 19-year-olds say profound things occasionally and are embarrassed when adults treat it as remarkable. "All right," she said, "next week, when your shoulder's stronger, I'll show you." She showed him what she knew. He paid attention. She thought that was probably the best thing you could do for another person. Teach them to pay attention. Roy Bassett attempted the cornbread again in April, and it was better. Not good, but better. She told him so, which was the truth, and which he received with more genuine pleasure than she would have received it herself in his position, which was one of the things she found she liked about Roy Bassett. The ranch moved into spring solvent, which it had not been in 3 years. Not comfortable, solvent. There's a difference, and she observed it honestly. There was work still to do, always would be, and the margin between functional and precarious was thinner than she'd like, and Victor Langley was still somewhere on the other side of the mountain pass with his survey maps and his rail corridor plans, and the right-of-way conversation would come someday in a different form. But the ranch was not afraid of that conversation. It had learned, over one winter, what it actually was. Not a failing operation stumbling toward collapse, but a working one that had needed someone to look at it clearly and say, here's what you have. Here's what it costs. Here's what you've been losing and where. Here's the distance between where you are and what's possible. The distance had turned out to be closable, not easily, not without the particular exhaustion of doing necessary things in the right order for months without knowing if they'd be enough, but closable. One evening in late April, Cole found her on the porch. Her porch now, the kitchen porch, where she'd taken to sitting in the late afternoon when the work was done and the light came over the mountain at an angle that made the valley look like itself at its best. He sat down beside her on the bench that had been there since the house was built, which was a good 30 years ago, and showed it. Langley sent a letter, he said. What did it say? That he hopes we're well and he looks forward to future conversations about the valley's development. He paused. Very polite. They always are, she said. He looked at the mountain. I'm not afraid of him anymore. She looked at the mountain too. The snow was almost gone from the lower face now. Another week, and it would be completely off. You weren't afraid of him before, she said. You were afraid of losing the ranch. Same thing. No, she said, it isn't. Being afraid of losing something you've built is reasonable. It's the right response to a real threat. It doesn't mean the person threatening you has power over you. He was quiet for a moment. When you were on that bench at the station, he said, were you afraid? She thought about it honestly. Not the way you'd expect, she said. I was cold. I was tired. She stopped, chose the word carefully. Suspended, like I was between something that had ended and something that hadn't started yet, and I couldn't see the other side. And now? She looked at the valley in the late light, at the fence line she could see from here properly posted, at the barn where the sound of the horses was the ordinary sound of things being cared for, at the kitchen window behind her, warm because there was always a fire going now. Now I'm on the other side, she said, and it turns out it looks a lot like the work. He nodded. She could feel him beside her, the solidity of him, the way some people occupy space without taking more than they need. I found something of Eleanor's, he said, going through the storage barn last week, a recipe book she kept. She waited. I thought you might want to look at it, he said. If you wanted, if it wasn't... He stopped. I don't know if that's strange to offer. It's not strange, she said. She was a good cook, he said. Better than me at most things. A pause that had something careful in it. She would have liked you. Margaret looked at the mountain. She thought about the women you never meet but come to know anyway, through kitchens they've used and things they've grown, and equipment they've oiled and recipes they've written in careful hands. She thought about the cultivating rig that Solomon Abernathy was turning good soil with on the East Claim, Eleanor's idea, finally doing what it was meant to do. She thought about the ways things outlast us and also the ways they don't, and the ways we go on after them, and also how we carry them anyway. I'd like to look at it, she said. He nodded. They sat a while longer in the cooling air, the light going slowly the way it does in spring, when the days are getting longer and the dark takes its time arriving. Not talking, not needing to. She had come to this valley with a carpet bag and the skills of a lifetime and nothing else. And she had found that the skills of a lifetime turn out to be enough, if you're willing to use them. That's the thing about competence that nobody tells you when you're young, and still think the world will reward you simply for having it. Competence doesn't protect you from hard times. It doesn't prevent loss or cold or the particular loneliness of a bench in November. What it does is give you something to work with when the hard times arrive, and the hard times always arrive. She had worked with what she had. That was all she'd done. And it turned out, as it turns out for anyone willing to do the same, that it was more than enough to make something real. The bench was cold, and the evening was coming, and the mountain was going dark at its edges, and she was warm enough, and she was here, and that would do. That would, in fact, more than do.